The encouragement, the will, the grit, the hope to where you can get is often comes from role models. It comes from other people's stories and journeys. And therefore, I couldn't have hoped for a more fitting chief guest for today than Akhil Gupta, the Vice Chairman of Bharti Enterprises and Executive Chairman of Bharti Infratel.
Good evening, friends. It's indeed a big privilege for me to be with all of you here. Thanks for this invitation. I have always felt that Treasury is one role, which is one of the most exciting roles in finance function. I think we all know that. To me, it's personally been something which is of great interest, partly because I could never understand it fully. Even today, Harjeet keeps telling me things which, just fly past me at times. But there's truly a role which is intriguing, which has so much happening, which is so changing all the time. There is so much of scope which has changed ever since I got into telecom, and that makes it truly a very exciting role to be in. I'm really delighted that, a function to directly recognize treasurers and, as you said, not an award, but a recognition of the brightest. I mean, come to think of it, for a country this big, the top 20 is something really privileged. The top 20 treasurers in a country of the size of India, each one of you, not only the ones who would be recognized, but the ones who have been nominated, I think are truly special. One thing which I have always felt, I think the Treasury function has never really got the importance or the recognition that it deserves. And as I was driving here, I was really just trying to think as to why is it so. I think the main reason for that is that there is always an ongoing debate whether it is the business success which makes the Treasury successful, or is it the Treasury's success which makes the business successful. Now, obviously, this is a very classic case to my mind of a chicken and egg, because both do depend on each other. There is no doubt there would be no Treasury function. We know a lot of companies whose financial performance is in doldrums. The brightest of the treasurers there would not be able to do anything. On the other hand, there are hundreds and thousands of companies who have had steady progress, who have had rapid progress, who have had a spectacular progress, because their treasury functions were able to support them at every step. In fact, anticipate the need of the businesses as the businesses became bigger. To me personally, this is one function which will always remain an extremely important function. Now, the reason I say that is because while it is true that Treasury's success will depend on how well the business is doing, but if you look around, there are hundreds of cases where the most successful companies have frittered away the opportunities, have gone from good to bad, because they could not manage their funds and the funding. So the Treasury function, the way it should have been for companies of those sizes, really did not work out the way it was supposed to do. I think we all need to recognize that for the best of the companies and the most successful companies, there is nothing which is static. There is no success which is static. There is an ongoing process of maintaining, building on those successes, and therefore, for every company, unless the funding or the fund requirement that they need for their future growth is there in time, there is no way, despite the fact that they have been very successful in the past, for them to become successful in future. Therefore, timely provision of funding, which is one of the pillars of the role which each one of you, the brightest treasurers in this country, perform, is an absolute must. One other aspect which I always find the role of treasurer to be of immense importance to a company is the fact that you contribute so heavily to the brand equity of a company that it's normally not even thought of. I think for any company's success, brand equity is very important. And if you are able to perform very well on the treasury front, the stronger image that you carry among the international financial community, you can imagine the wonders it does to the brand equity of a company. Therefore, while this is supposed to be a very hardcore finance function dealing in real money and raising money, investing money, I think one softer aspect of this function is also enhancement of the brand equity. And therefore, every time you go and haggle for that extra 5 basis points of spread is not merely to save money to the organization, but when you come back and say we have been able to raise funds at the best possible terms, there is a huge enhancement to the brand equity of a company. Imagine you performing in a company where you come back and say, well, I've raised the money, but sorry, at 700 basis points above LIBOR. You know where the reputation of that company goes. I'm sure, well, factually, I would have loved to participate in some of the sessions. As I said, I find them very intriguing. There's so much going around in this function. We all know this function has evolved from treasurer role as it was understood, which was literally a khazanchi, to what it is today. Today, perhaps in every company, at least the large ones, a treasurer's role, we all know, is a coveted role. It's an extremely specialized role, and it is something which people aspire for. Now, I put the evolution of this role in 3 or 4 parts. I think the first one is that the sources from which you can today raise funds is unimaginable. What initially when we started, it was just a few banks. That's where you could raise funds. It went on to addition of the ECAs, the EKNs and the Fenveras of the world, in the telecom world. But today, I think the options where you can raise, what you can raise is enormous. The second is the instruments and the tenors. Earlier it used to be, it's 5 years, 7 years. Today, the variety that you have and the options that you have is mind-boggling. The third big aspect, of course, of this function, which has evolved as big time, is the risk management. And I'm not only talking of the risk associated with currencies, the risk associated with whether you go for a fixed rate or a floating rate, and so on. This is risk associated with the whole business, and I'll talk a little about that aspect, because as a treasurer, you also have to warn the top management and the board about the risk associated not just on the pricing or on which currency you borrow, but in terms of the real risk facing the company in terms of its whole funding and leveraging. And the next I would say is, of course, today ratings and the relationship with the investors into bonds or with banks is become a very important part. It wasn't a very structured role earlier, but I think today it has become an extremely important one. And finally, of course, investment of surplus. Earlier there were small surpluses, today there are large surpluses, and therefore the options in which you can invest has also grown. Of course, this is something which you all know, but when you combine all this, I think the complications do multiply, because every time you add a new dimension, there is a geometric progression in the complication with which you have to pass the test. So let's see, what is the requirement for meeting this kind of evolution and the challenges? To my mind, I think the treasurer's role, which used to be that a CFO or the CEO, as the case may be, would fundamentally tell what is the money requirement, when do we need it. He was supposed to do that. I think that has had a dramatic change. And today's requirement from a successful treasurer is he has no option but to understand every little aspect of business. Not just finance, not just the P&L and balance sheet, the technology, the competition, evolving technologies. If I take the telecom parlance, I think the treasurer will have to be absolutely up to date in terms of what the new competition in form of Reliance Jio is coming, what could that do, how would they fare with just the 4G and without 3G, and so on. I'm sure in every industry there will be aspects. Therefore, a treasurer, from being a finance person, to my mind has no choice today but to kind of at least become a general manager in his knowledge. He has got to understand every part of the business, because he will be asked questions which he has got to answer. In that sense, I think he starts shadowing the CFO and is akin to a CFO in terms of his knowledge, in terms of his contribution to the business, and in partnering with the operations. The other requirement which I think all of you today face is constant innovation, because the world is changing. The options by which you can perform your duties are changing, and obviously, since you are the brightest, I'm sure you always have this urge and you always raise the bar for yourself, not for anybody else, but for yourself, in terms of getting better terms, in being more innovative, in expanding the base from which you can raise funds, and so on. I also feel that in terms of the requirement, since a treasurer has to understand every aspect, naturally he has also got to address all the constituents and the stakeholders. And therefore, one big requirement from a treasurer, to me at least, is he has got to be able to move away from the financial jargon to a simplified version of whatever he is doing, to be able to address the non-financial stakeholders. That would include the boards, some members of the audit committee, the general functional heads of others, the senior management. And that, I think, must never be underestimated, because unless a treasurer can make other people understand his point of view and the risks which he sees in the organization vis-a-vis the treasury function, he will never get their support. Therefore, simplification is a big requirement. And finally, of course, as a part of risk management, the fundamental risk I find is the treasurers could lose control of self-discipline. And that's where Anurag was saying, I've actually forgotten about that debate with Mohan. There was this, I remember now, big debate whether a treasury function should be a profit center or should it be a defensive strategy. Well, by and large, it would depend on every organization. My view always is a treasury, unless it's in a financial services company where the whole business is about treasury, will have to be a defensive function. Because the reason that business exists and how it earns has to be something different. The operations have to be something different. A treasury has got to be a function which is going to keep things in check, which will ensure that the risks that you're taking are calculated and sensible risks. Therefore, I would still feel that for operating companies where the business is other than finances, a treasury should be a little cautious. It should be defensive. But irrespective of that, whatever is the strategy of the company, I think the self-discipline by a treasurer is an absolute must. It's also, I think, quite important to see what should be the progression path for a treasurer. The first step, which I personally feel all companies should entrust to their treasurer, is investor relations. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, a treasurer has got to be an all-round knowledge center. And if he has knowledge and he can address the rating agencies and the bond investors and the banks, just entrust him with the task of addressing all investors. In any case, raising equity also has to be a part of his function. He is in the best position. And I can say this with a lot of authority, because in our case, Harjeet, who is our treasurer, is also the head of investor relations. So I'm speaking from what we have actually done with great success. And I must admit, we had started initially this thing as an experiment because our treasury was too small. Harjeet was a big banker who came to us from Citibank, and we felt that we have to give him an additional role. But as time has gone by, I think it's a wonderful combination of mixing treasury function with investor relations. The second step, very obviously, you are shadowing the CFO. It's up to you. I think you have to aspire to be the CFOs as the second step. And finally, you know, as CFOs, it's then for you to decide. You want to specialize in that function. It's such a deep function, you can do whatever you want within the function to specialize, or go for the general management role. People like me, of course, chose onto the general management path, but that could have been the reason that I wasn't too good at the function. But that's an individual choice. I would really want to see each one of you, who are the brightest treasurers in this country, as the years go by, I would love to see all of you in the CFO role to begin with, and then scale greater heights. Congratulations to not only the winners today, but all the nominees. I think you guys are doing a great job. My best wishes, and I hope to be able to be part of your celebrations in years to come. Thank you very much.